Our last speaker for this evening is Professor Derek Pensler. Derek Pensler is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History and directs Harvard Center for Jewish Studies. Pensler is a resident faculty member at the Center of European Studies and also affiliated with the Harvard Center for the Middle Eastern Studies. Please.
תודה רבה אורית על ההזמנה להשתתף בערב חגיגה הזה, ואתם כבר שמעתם 3 הרצאות מרתקות ומאלפות, ועכשיו אתם צריכים לשמוע עוד הרצאה בשפה לועזית, ואני לא יודע מה אני אוסיף, כבר למדתם מן ההרצאות הקודמות, אבל אעשה כמיטב יכולתי. So it is a great pleasure and honor to be with you to celebrate the publication of Orit's new book. And I just want to mention right from the start, this is Orit's 3rd major book in less than 2 decades, which is a remarkable accomplishment considering that Orit puts into every book an enormous amount of archival research, painstaking and nuanced reading of sources. And in that sense, she is quite the model historian. Orit's work has been steeped since its beginning in the methodologies of social history, but in recent years she embraced an analytical framework that privileges emotion as a lens for understanding human sensibility. Orit and I have spent a lot of time over the last years talking about the field of the history of emotion, which over the past quarter century has generated a vast literature. And what I'd like to do this evening, in some sense I'll be recapitulating what people have already said about the content of Orit's book, but I want to always address the question how the book contributes to our understanding of political emotion in general. There's a lot of work obviously about human emotion in history, particularly about collective emotion. Much of that literature is about sub-state or non-state institutions. The educational system, the family, civil society, intellectual communities, literature, and the fine arts. There's a great deal of discussion of the formation of emotional norms. It's less common for historians of emotion to combine that study of civil society and individuals, so-called non-elites, with the highest levels of state government as a creator of those norms and as an agent of emotional management. Now, this task usually has fallen more to political scientists, especially those who work in international relations. The literature on emotions in international relations has become so well developed that already a decade ago, a synthetic volume on the subject, bringing together the main findings of a sizable matrix of scholars, was published. But the focus of these studies, not surprisingly, tends to be contemporary rather than historical. For example, there's a sizable literature on the American governments and American societies' reaction to 9/11, within a framework of a cultivated discourse of an eternal war on terror, of fear, as a means of suppressing dissent. It is very rare for an international relations scholar to actually work on history, as Todd Hall did in an interesting recent article on outrage as a distinct factor behind the outbreak of war, in this case the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. But Todd doesn't use archives because, well, that's just not what social scientists do. There might be some social scientists here who use archives, but we historians like to be territorial. This is where Orit's book makes its signal contribution. It explores the young Israeli state's efforts to create an emotional regime, a set of emotional norms to keep panic at bay by encouraging states of calm. And by the way, I believe that calm and contentment and so forth very much are emotions. I think they have their own unique emotional valence. But anyway, we can talk about it another time. A sense of constant preparedness among a heterogeneous and divided population. The emotional regime is created by many forces, state institutions, including the educational system, the mass media, and civil society, especially in an era, as was the case for Israel during its first decade, where the state had considerable reach over the public sphere. Orit's emphasis on emotions, how they were felt, perceived, signaled, and managed, represents a pioneer contribution to Israeli historiography, which until now has scarcely engaged with, as I mentioned a moment ago, a highly well-established field of the history of emotions. But more than that, Orit's book contributes to the historiography of emotion as such, precisely because it uses historical as opposed to model-driven social scientific method. Her meticulous archival research, her three-dimensional representations of historic figures, her nuanced analysis of complex events. Orit's book reminds me, in many ways, of Yael Zerubbabel's classic book from 1998, Recovered Roots, which was widely read by scholars in many fields and of many parts of the world who were interested in the creation of collective memory. I believe that memory studies were to the 1990s what emotion studies is to the 2010s and 20s. Now, Orit begins her book by demonstrating the disconnect between aspirational norms proffered by elites and the sensibilities of the Israeli public. During the 1950s, immigrants in the border communities were, understandably, given to fear and panic. The government comforted them. It sent officials to raise morale and teach the immigrants guard duty, giving them a sense of security, not of actual physical security that it's guaranteeing them their physical safety, but giving them that psychological boost that comes from the bearing of arms, because the state could not actually guarantee their physical safety. Instead, it engaged in symbolic gestures, which instilled, as the political scientist Jennifer Mitzen wrote almost 20 years ago in a classic article, ontological security. And ironically, the less physically secure a population, the greater ontological security it can enjoy, because there's nothing better in terms of knowing exactly who and what you are than if somebody hates you, and if you feel that you have some agency over your fate. The significance of the title of Orit's book, Emotions in Conflict, becomes clear already at the beginning when she describes political elites actually accusing the immigrants, particularly those from Middle Eastern lands, of being psychologically frail and overwrought. That is, assurance and sympathy blended with criticism, if not scorn. And that's an echo, I think, of themes from Orit's first book on the invention of the individual in 1950s Israel. Another type of conflict emerged in the wake of the announcement of the Czech arms deal with Egypt in 1955, when the government encouraged a state of vigilance that acknowledged a serious security threat, but steered clear of paralyzing fear or panic by mobilizing the public to donate money and time for the defense of the border settlements. And this theme about instilling a sense of, again, the sense of resilience, right, as opposed to a lack of fear, comes through also in her chapter on the reprisal attacks of the 1950s, attacks which were intended to deter Arab infiltration, raise civilian morale, and restore a sense of moral balance. And I noticed that buried in the footnotes of Orit's book, it was a reference to an extremely important scholar, William Ian Miller, a rather eccentric legal scholar who has written an important book on concepts of lex talionis. For Ben-Gurion, a state operated according to a moral logic that transcended the thirst for vengeance, an essential concept, I would say, of a Weberian notion of the bureaucratic state, which not only holds a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, but also employs violence judiciously. And this concept of the dispassionate administration of violence against vigilantism is something worth thinking through in many different contexts, perhaps most colorfully illustrated for those of you who like classic cinema in the final scene of Fritz Lang's film from 1931, M, in which a child murderer about to be lynched by the families of his victims is literally wrested from the murderous mob by the hand of governing authority, which arrests him in the name of the state. He's going to be killed no matter what, but he's going to be killed within the Rechtsstaat and not by a mob. In the young state of Israel, a striving for justice, not vengeance, underlay the common phrase from the era, Jewish blood will not be forfeit, dam Yehudi lo hefker. The effort to channel and direct fear rather than suppress it characterized the government's response to provocations from Syria against the northern settlements. While the Israeli press hailed the resilience and grit of the settlements, the Jews themselves prevaricated between a desire to protect their children by sending them to safer ground and the sense that these children, as the next generation of sturdy pioneers, needed to endure a baptism of fire. This dilemma raises deep and troubling questions about the tension within any society between parental love and the conditions under which parents are willing to bear the prospect of their children being placed into battle, a tension that requires enormous effort in terms of the inculcation of norms, leading to an Abrahamic willingness for sacrifice and a zeal for and a terror of social shaming. Although most of the book deals with varieties of emotional experience across classes or sub-ethnicities, or between elites and the public, the book's final chapter discusses change over time. And we've already heard a couple of speakers discuss her revisionist account of the Hamtanah, the transition from powerful feelings of fear of the Arab armies to a sense of confidence and determination, even before the formation of the national government on the 1st of June and the outbreak of the war 4 days later. It's very interesting here where Orit, who I talk about, engages high politics, but she also is capable, unlike most historians who very few can do both, goes down to the level really of almost microhistory to revise historiographical understanding, not to mention collective memory, according to which the Israeli population was riddled with anxiety and, like the chief of staff Yitzhak Rabin, was worked up into a state of nervous exhaustion. She shows a very different public mood. But I think there's an important, I would say, ramification of the later part of her chapter when she talks about the emotional regime of restraint after the war cracking, as elation, euphoria, and giddy pride vied with expressions of combat trauma, for example, embodied in Siach Lochamim. An understated theme here, and yet an essential one, is the disruptive potential of euphoria. Euphoria being a polar opposite, and yet a close relative of rage. Euphoric joy, one could argue, is to happiness what rage is to anger. Euphoria is quite a dangerous political emotion. Now, the entire book has much to offer, but Orit's 5th chapter on the emotional dimensions of Jewish-Arab relations deserves to be singled out. Set against the background of the gradual dismantling of military rule over Israel's Arab citizens living in rural communities and the growth of an Arab urban working class, the chapter traces the clash between Jewish feelings of anxiety and suspicion towards Arabs, feelings that led to various forms of discrimination against them, and a refusal to acknowledge that discrimination, as evinced by the harsh critiques of the short film Ani Ahmed from 1966. I assigned this film to my students, and the students see it in their jaded 2024 eyes as being painfully transparent and naive. It's very interesting to view the film through their eyes, as well as to try to imagine how it was viewed through people in 1966. Orit carefully contextualizes negative emotions towards Arabs within a broader framework of Jewish historical animosity towards Gentiles. But at the same time, she observes how the dispossession of the Palestinians left Israelis distrustful of, and interestingly, even disgusted by Arab professions of loyalty to the state. Orit shows that hatred of Arabs was rarely publicly expressed, something that Anita talked about in her magnificent opening lecture. And in that sense, I would add, Israel was actually similar to East Bloc and post-colonial regimes that preached what was called in Tito's Yugoslavia brotherhood and unity between historically dominant and dominated nationalities, even if in reality such amity was notable for its absence. So Emotions of Conflict is a superb book in terms of its archival work, its sensitive of sources, its nuanced argumentation, and its theoretical sophistication. In the time remaining to me, though, I'd like to explore how Orit's analytical framework could be deepened and expanded for future research on Israeli history by Orit, her students, or other scholars. The literature on political emotion in history tends to focus on negative emotions more than positive ones. My wife once asked me why I had multiple copies of the same book in my office. She was looking at several books with the word fear in the title. The emphasis on fear, anger, and hatred is largely linked with the negative view propagated in Western historiography that national movements are distinctive for their propagation of hatred of others, and that nation states invariably become either rapacious colonial empires or bastions of sullen irredentism, Britain or Bulgaria, as it were. These views are, in my opinion, mistaken. The notion that modern politics have an exclusive claim on destructive hatred is disproved by even the most casual reading of pre-modern history, and nationalism has been no more destructive a belief system than organized religion. The difference between a pre-modern war of religion and the mass slaughter of the 20th century was technical, not conceptual. Moreover, the success of the modern nation state cannot be understood without appreciating its power to mobilize support via positive emotions such as love, pride, and hope. As Orit shows in her book, the emotional regime of the young Israeli state, and I would add that of many other regimes throughout the post-1945 world, artfully blended together negative and positive emotion, cultivating concern and vigilance rather than debilitating fear and panic, wariness but not blind hatred of the enemy. The state has had a vested interest in shying away from encouraging animosities that might blossom into rage, as I referred earlier, being a complete loss of emotional control that can unleash destructive forces causing internal as well as external damage. In a provocative recent article, Yair Berlin, very talented young scholar, has argued for the positive value of negative emotions, such as fear, in religions where the sublime majesty of the divine is manifest in its power to destroy or save the cowering mortal. In the classic prophetic model, theorized many centuries later by Weber, God's chastisement is proof of his love for his chosen people. In a more secular vein, Ronald Schachter has written of the emotional thrill of fear of the absolutist ruler in early modern Europe. Paeans to the ruler as, quote, the terror of his enemies were expressions of awe, a transcendental form of fear. Post-colonial states have taken a more secular and pedestrian approach to the inculcation of fear into the citizenry. Totalitarian and authoritarian states subject the population to earthly terror. The supreme leader is awful, but perhaps not awe-inspiring. But the source of that awe is the terror they unleash on their own citizens. However, new democratic states have not had the time to build up the institutions and physical structures that would elevate them to the sublime in the eyes of their population. Rather, unless the state uses really the means of terror constantly against them, the state has to be seen as an extension of the citizen. It can be an object of critique, complaint, and expectation. Relating these observations to Israel, so far as I know, and Orit and the rest of you can correct me, most Jewish citizens of Israel during the 1950s and 60s did not fear the state. Possible exceptions would have been activists within Cherut and Maki, representing the far right and far left respectively, who railed against the power of the state and its dominant party. But the abandon with which Cherut's leader, Menachem Begin, issued his thundering denunciations of the state suggests he feared no consequences for his actions. It's worth thinking over whether this sense of proximity to state power, the relative lack of fear, derived from particular circumstances of recent Jewish history and Israel's characteristics, such as its novelty, poverty, and small size, or perhaps a distinct craving for dignity and pride as a recompense for the otherwise unbearable losses of the Holocaust. Or maybe these were features of democratic post-colonial states, where open confrontation with state authority was actually no less common than brutal repression of dissent, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has described for post-independence India. Unlike most of its Middle Eastern neighbors, Israel, during the period covered in Orit's book, was not a Mukhabarat state, although it had a well-developed security service to supervise the state's Arab minority. The emotional regime constructed by the state was perforce based on a contract, at least with the Jewish majority. And when Israel's Jewish citizens felt that the contract was not being fulfilled, they spoke out. Yes, the state preached emotional norms to enhance its social stability and security, but the acceptance of those norms was the result of negotiation and not imposition. So I think it's worth thinking about in the Israeli context, but also thinking broadly in a post-colonial context, and not only in terms of repression and the like, although that certainly was a feature. I'm going to end my remarks with some questions for Orit. What became of the state's emotional regime from the 1950s and 60s? To what extent did it survive the waning and the fall of labor Zionist rule over Israel? What has become of the sort of things you write about in the book? A search for justice rather than revenge when responding to Palestinian attacks. A security contract between the citizen and the state. The sense that the state is an extension of the self rather than its adversary. And what has become of an emotional regime based on, as you title your book, emotions in conflict? The Israeli state's power is vastly greater than it was decades ago, but a little over a year ago, it experienced a terrible assault, far greater than anything that befell the state during its formative years. Do the authorities continue to craft an emotional regime that blends fear, vigilance, and confidence? Or are there other factors at work in terms of the content and form of emotional messaging? Is there, in fact, any emotional regime in contemporary Israel? With that, I will stop, and I look forward to Orit's replies. Thank you.